Hi, I'm Angie Chattlin, and I am the retired president of CarMax Auto Finance. We were a leading division of CarMax, the auto superstores. And I retired about 3 years ago and am now working with my husband on some real estate ventures and mostly giving my time to charity and family. And wow, if I were to give you a start, I'd probably start with my grandparents. As amazing as that might seem. But my dad's parents were farmers, entrepreneurs. He had a farm that we worked on with him. He also had a grocery store right along with his home. So I learned to run a cash register, and it was an old-fashioned cash register too, which as a kid I loved. We learned hard work ethic from them. And my other set of grandparents is probably where I got a lot of my genetic disposition. My grandfather was a mathematician, and he taught math, but he also worked at Redstone Arsenal and worked with the famous German scientist Werner von Braun and worked on the first rocket to circle the Earth. But he was also one of those guys that just believed you should have a second source of income. So he taught us that you should also have a business that earned money even without you there. So we had laundromats, and we had one. And when my parents got old enough, they joined him and his wife in this business. They had three. So I also grew up mopping floors. We used to rob them once a week. That was the most fun. We got all the quarters and then we counted them. But it's probably where integrity first started for me. We counted every quarter, we reported every quarter as income, and we gave the IRS their fair share. There was no one for me, two for the business kind of attitude that you will find in a cash business. They also led in the community. My grandmother had family that had polycystic kidney disease, and she just found a real passion for finding solutions for this small town. And so she and my grandfather convinced a kidney doctor, to move into town and open a practice. And then they opened Athens Kidney Association and started that branch there. They raised money. She quilted. I used to tease her that to see one of her quilts, I was going to have to go meet with these strangers because she quilted at least one a year, and then they raffled them off. But they're very involved in the community, very involved in church with their friends, starting new things that really advanced this small town. And I am from a small town, Athens, Alabama. It's grown a lot since I left, but it's still a small town. And it meant that you knew a lot of people and they knew you. And my dad was a police officer in the town. He grew to become a lieutenant. That also kept me on the straight and narrow a bit because I knew he was around, and if he wasn't around, all the guys were around, and the girls were watching out for what his little girl was doing. My mom she was fabulous. She's probably one of the smartest women I knew, but as she says, she put my dad through school, and he got his degree, and she just worked. She worked for a doctor's office. She became the manager there. And then she ran the books for the laundromat. And then she was always looking for different ways to make money, whether it was, let's buy this duplex and rent it out. And a lot of ideas my dad said no to, but she was just ingenious that way and just continued to think. And if I think about my parents and what I learned from them, my dad taught me to be competitive. I think he was really focused on having the first female football player. I think he taught me to throw a football before I could do anything else. He was also a police officer, so we had guns around the house, so I learned to fire a weapon pretty early. And in today's world, that might be seen as really negative, but it was absolutely positive for us because we knew to respect weaponry. We heard every story of every accident, and we knew exactly what we should and shouldn't do, probably from the age of 4 or 5, because they were around and we needed to understand them. But he taught me to be competitive. He taught me that just because I was a girl didn't mean that I could just do girl things. So I chopped wood with him. Many a Saturday morning, we would head out to the woods, and he would identify which trees he was cutting down, and he sawed them, and we toted logs. And I was one of those people who wanted to tote the biggest log. If my brother, who was 2 years younger than me, but he was still a boy, and if he could tote it, I could tote it. Or if my uncle could tote it, I could too. And so a lot of that kind of very involved in farming. Even we had a lot. We farmed. I weeded. My dad wasn't really into you being still. He had lots of things for you to do. You came home from school, and here was your chore list, and we were out doing chores, whether it was cutting the grass or weeding the corn or picking the corn or shucking. And then my mom froze, canned, did a variety of things like that. So even though we lived in the city, we still had a lot of that farming, just down home feel to the life we led. And so that was probably my dad. My mom, on the other hand, taught me to be compassionate and to love and to care. Love God and love others. Truly, if the church door was open, we were walking through it. That's 3 times a week. Probably 10 when we had a meeting, when we had a guest speaker. But she was adamant about learning scripture and prayer, and I must have heard, let your yes be yes and your no be no, every day of my life. And she would help anybody. She really believed the Good Samaritan story, and that you never met a stranger, and that if they needed something, you gave it to them, no matter who they were. But she's a great example of that. She's a wonderful woman. And I'm lucky to have had her as my mom. So I went through high school in this little town, had a great time. And I was destined, math was my specialty. That's where I was strongest. And I thought engineering was where I would focus my studies and I would become an engineer. So I was all set to go to University of Alabama in Huntsville, be local, still stay pretty close to home. And had my tuition paid for there. And so I was ready to go. But, after you take your exams, you start to get letters from colleges. And it's a pivot point in life that is truly random. But my girlfriend and I decided that if the dean of admissions actually signed the letter from their school, that we would send back the information card to get more information. And it turns out that Dennis Matthews, the dean of admissions at Oglethorpe University, actually signed his letter. And I sent in for information. We got the information pack, and here's this beautiful school. It looked like it was from England, and it was just amazing to me. Totally enamored with both the beauty, as well as they had a program where you were required to do classes in all kinds of disciplines. And I looked at my mom, and she said, there's no way you can go there. It was extremely expensive, obviously, out of town, out of state, and private. So I said, can I at least fill out the scholarship application? And she said, well, sure. So I did, and I was invited to compete for the James Edward Oglethorpe Scholarship. And the story goes that I did really well in the verbal debate. All the professors said, you totally won that round, but my written debate was just not good. It meant that I did not get the full scholarship. I got half. So we figured it out. Mom figured out how to put in a little bit of money, and then I borrowed the rest. And I left town, math geek, going to liberal arts school. So there's hope for any student out there who's not quite in the school they think they should have been. And that's probably one of the things I try to talk to the youth in our church about is, okay, we stress our kids out so much these days about how to prepare for college and where they're going to go to college and exactly what they're going to study. And I just tell them my story. I'm like, it may matter in certain disciplines, but it'll work out. It'll be okay. So I entered this liberal arts college, math geek. I didn't have to take calculus, so I never entered the math school. Never walked in. So my freshman year, I took computer science. I thought I would do a computer science minor, and that was kind of the rage. It was 86, so not quite technology explosion of the early 90s, but it was certainly getting started. But I took Turbo Pascal, and I realized that, well, this is kind of, it was actually easy for me, and I don't want to say that I mean that in the most humble way, but it was pretty easy. And the crowd I was hanging out with in computer science wasn't exactly my kind of crowd, and so I quit computer science, much to my dismay, probably. I took accounting 1 and 2, and that's really where my math stopped. But I had this freshman professor in English who taught me, his whole bent was just logically looking at writing. What is this author trying to say? And did they get their point across? And how could they have done it better? And he totally tapped my analytical brain in a totally new discipline. And if you remember, it's a discipline I wasn't that great at, right? I lost half a scholarship because I couldn't write very well at the time. But he captured me, he captured my attention, and I figured out how to get my business degree with a econ major and a second major in English, which is kind of crazy. But I would have told you at college I was going to go on to be a professor, that I would either teach English or I would teach economics. I took a French class, and I lasted about 3 tests. This small town girl from Alabama did not get French at all. It's probably one of the few classes that truly threw me for a loop, but I was smart enough to withdraw before it impacted GPA. But I decided that professor in English might not be where I really should deploy my talents. But I took my GMATs and I looked at different business schools. To this day, I was trying to remember what schools I applied for. I don't think I could tell you. I know that I was waitlisted for school in DC, and then I just started the job search. And so that was 1990, and I realized I was applying for jobs that other MBA students were applying for. So they had gone straight from college to grad school, and we're now on the interviewing circuit, and we're competing for the same jobs. It wasn't a great job market in 1990. So I decided I probably should get some experience, get some real job experience. Decided not to pursue an MBA, get that first job, do 2 to 3 years, and then go back. And that was kind of my plan. So I interviewed with bankers, I interviewed with insurance companies, interviewed with sales, and then I got a phone call. Yet another really odd pivot point in life. Our head of career planning and placement called and said, we want you to come in 2 days and interview with this company called Circuit City Stores. And I said, they sell TVs. And she said, yes, they do. But they are opening a new corporate office here in Georgia to do a credit card bank. I'm like, oh, what? She goes, I can't tell you any more than that, but we want to put some of our best students in front of them. And the program was called a finance trainee program. And I said, but I've had finance class, but I'm not a finance major. She said, it's okay. I want you to come to this interview. So the day of this interview, I had done class that morning, and the afternoon I had an internship with a marketing firm, and I was just so tired. I probably looked a little worn, a little weary, and I walked to the career planning and placement. I got to the door. I turned around. I was like, I'm not the right fit for this job. I'm exhausted. I'm tired. I walked probably 20 feet away. And then I said, this is not you. You cannot just not show. That is just not who you are. So I turned around and I walked back through. 2 hours later, we finished the interviews. And I was pretty convinced this is where I wanted to work, and they were pretty convinced they wanted me to work there. And what's crazy about that is that I had no idea where the office would be. My aunt called and said, do not work in retail. She had been assistant manager at a store forever. She thought retail, you just gave up so much of your life. And I told her it's okay. I was working in more of a corporate world. Well, little did I know that, when you're running a credit card bank, you're open when the stores are open. And if you're on the East Coast and your stores are on the West Coast, you have operations open to midnight. And weekends. And so I signed up for retail, whether I knew I was signing up for retail or not. Started my first gig, had no idea where the office would be, so they sent us to Richmond, Virginia for the first 2 months. I lived in corporate housing, got assignments like, here, take all these HR policies and read them, and basically, in today's world, we would do just a quick Word doc and replace everywhere it said Circuit City, and we would have replaced it with the new bank name. But we also had to put in some new policies specifically for the bank. So we did some research, wrote those up, and then one day we were as trainees, they took us everywhere. We were really lucky. There were 3 of us. And we went down to Total Systems, which is located in Columbus, Georgia. And we went through a training session on how the credit system would work, how it would approve people, how it would decline people. I'll be honest, some of the language was foreign to me, how to read a credit bureau. Didn't really learn that in college. I didn't know what an I-9 or an I-1 or an R. I mean, it was just foreign. But we had great management that took us under their wing and taught us the language, taught us what we were seeing. And we were just sponges, just learning everything we could. And then I found myself in a room with the president of the bank and a consultant he had brought in to help him get this all organized and established, along with the entire management team. And there are 3 of us right out of college, right, sitting around the table with all this experience. And they had brought in the gentleman who had developed the program that we were trying to set up in order to do all of our credit underwriting. And the bank president was describing the problems he wanted to fix or things he wanted the system to do, and the gentleman was trying to solve these problems for him. And one particular problem just stumped them, and they weren't coming up with a solution. And I raised my hand, little bold one that I was, and said, can't we do? And the gentleman who had written the software program looked at the bank president, he looked at me, and he said, she's right, we could totally do that. And another huge pivot point for me, just raising my hand, and all of a sudden I was in charge of setting up the credit systems for this bank operation, how to get the systems to do what we wanted to do. And oftentimes I was calling and they would put me through to this gentleman, and I'd say, can we do? And he said, just test it, Angie. It just became sort of the way to get things done. Just test it and see. But it meant that I spent unreal time with the president of the operation. Every Saturday morning, we would pull credit applications and pull a sampling and see who do we approve and who do we decline? What was the credit limit? He would identify people he didn't want approved anymore, and he would identify people that he wanted approved. And then my job was to look at it and evaluate it and decide, how could I get the system to do that? And who else would it let in if we made the changes? But what it meant was, not only did I get his attention, but all of a sudden I was brought into meetings with the CFO of Circuit City. Again, I'm still in my first year out of college, and again in a meeting on the phone, and he asked the question, and everybody looks at me, and I answered it. And all of a sudden he wanted to know who I was and where I came from and where I was going. And what I found out later is it didn't take long before he was insistent that I move to Richmond. And wow, amazing to hear that later on. But truly just from I'd love to call happenstance, just being brave in a world where I don't really have a lot to lose. But after my first year, I moved to Richmond, Virginia, and I stayed on the bank side of the operation for another year. And then they asked me to, I got my first promotion into management out of program, which was generally not the case. Generally, they wanted you to be in program for 2 years, come out for another 1 to 2 years, maybe in 4 to 5, you could then lead a division or department. So I moved out of the bank operation into the accounting department for Circuit City. And I sort of reminded them that I'd had accounting 1 and 2 my freshman year, but that was about it. And they said, that's okay, we'll teach you what you need to know. In my first 2 weeks, so the department was credit and collections. So I had the check pay type and the credit card pay type for Circuit City, which mostly meant we handled all the return checks and work that we did with external vendors to guarantee those checks. Or on the credit card side, it was all about chargebacks and how much do we pay the credit card companies in order to take those credit cards. They called them discounts, but we had to pay them. In my first week, I sat down with the assistant controller and she said, well, we put in a new technology about 6 months ago into the check side, and your subsystem and your GL are out of balance by, I don't even remember the number, call it 200,000. And I looked at her and I said, is that a good thing or a bad thing? She's like, uh-oh, what have I signed up for? And I'm like, and what's a GL? You're going to have to teach me the language, right? GL, P&L, liability. It was fascinating to go from this analytical world into the accounting world. And what I quickly figured out, though, is that accounting on the receivable side was truly a math equation. What you did to one side, you had to do the other. And so we had to figure out how this new system was working, when it was making GL entries, when it wasn't. And I got really lucky. I had an accounting clerk on my team who was really IT oriented, and he was going to school and working for us full time. And he was a wizard. And I sat with him and I said, just show me everything. Show me what you do when you bring in these return checks. What do we do to close them out? And then we tracked where the entries were going, and he learned and set up a system on how to reconcile these accounts. And as long as we could get them to reconcile for the last, it's one of those things in accounting, you found the same difference for the last 5 months. And then we whittled our variance down to where it was manageable, and we knew we were balanced going forward. And then we just wrote off those differences. But we narrowed the gap very significantly. So we fixed that, and then I set up processes so the accounting largely could be done without me. We had supervisors, we had others in charge, and then I went to work looking at the operations in stores. How do we take checks? What's that process look like? Well, at the time, so the micro line is that long line of numbers at the bottom of every check. So our cashiers, our guys, when they were checking people out, they had to type in that number. And at the time, I don't know if you remember, but the guys showing you the TVs and had expertise in that area, VCRs, refrigerators, they were experts in those models. They were also typing out every single one of these numbers. And I said, there's got to be technology to read that line. And so it was the first thing we did. We knocked 30 seconds off of the transaction, which got me the attention of the store operations team. So then I started really working with them more, looking at technology on the check side, technology on the credit card side. But I definitely figured out that that's probably more of my passion than the pure accounting. And so about 2 years into the assignment, I looked around and I thought, I don't necessarily see my next move. And I was young, I was still green, and I didn't realize that you should probably tap the next level. You did have a CFO who's kind of watching your career. I was probably a little naive to that, and so I started looking externally, and partly because I looked at the executive team of Circuit City and I said, not a single one of those folks have been with the same company their entire career. So I'm going to have to move. I'm going to have to go figure out, am I successful because of this environment, or could I be more successful elsewhere? But I knew that I could learn just because it would be different. And so I ended up, I had a vendor who the leader in that vendor went to GE Capital. And she called and said, I want you to think about coming to Cincinnati. And I said, Cincinnati? You're getting a little far north for this Alabama girl. And she said, come on, come talk to us. So I went and talked to the crew at GE Capital in Cincinnati, and I took a job with them. And I remember turning in my resignation to Circuit City, and that was probably one of the hardest things ever in my career. Not only was my boss, who was the assistant controller, just sort of taken aback and not ready for that, and then of course I had to talk to the controller, and then I was called to the CFO's office, and he looked at me square in the face and said, I'm so disappointed. And I busted out in tears. I know tears aren't supposed to be in the workplace, but I cried like a baby. And I was like, but Mr. Chalafu, it'll be okay. I'm going to go learn. And I gave him a whole spiel about, the senior executive team, none of you have always been here at Circuit City, and you were with Burger King before, and you tell us Burger King stories all the time, right? So I need some other experience. They had some other things in mind for me that I didn't know about. But I left, and I went to GE Capital in Cincinnati, and quickly I started in their operations team. Well, I started and ended in their operations team, but I started sort of in a team leadership role. And one of the things that was happening at this time is that teaser rates were running rampant, balance transfers was kind of the sort of the story going on in credit cards, and no one on the risk side had any idea how this was all really going to play out. It was such a transition in credit, and completely how are consumers really going to handle these changes in the teaser rates, the balances that are outstanding. Credit card debt was continuing to rise, I think, and our culture was changing. Right? We were more using credit cards as a means of life, as a way to get something today and pay for it later, as opposed to sort of an emergency need. And you started to see that changing. But I made my mark. I was promoted in 6 months. So at age 27, I was an officer of GE Capital. And I remember the head of HR who came and shook my hand and said, congratulations, you're now an officer. You can now be sued. I was like, what? I can now be what? He said, you can now be sued. And I was like, oh, great. What else? He's like, not much. But it was exciting. It was exciting for me. Here I was, 27 and having a blast. We launched some new credit cards for other co-branded deals. I learned so much, and I was only here for about 16 months, but I worked with one of the best call center leaders I had ever worked for, and he just expanded my thought process, expanded my learning. We sort of reorganized ourselves so that I actually did business development, so instead of really running a team. And then one day, another random pivot point in my life, I had sent a Christmas card to my old boss, and my birthday is 5 days after Christmas, so she had called me and said, happy birthday, but missed me, left me a voicemail. So just after New Year, I called her to say Happy New Year, and I caught her in office. And this is 96. And as I'm talking to her, she said, hold on just a minute. You're never going to guess who just walked into my office. So she put me on speaker, and it was the controller. And he said, hey, how's it going? I'm like, it's going great. I'm having fun, learning a lot. Here's what's happening. And he said, okay, are you ready to come back? I said, oh, yeah. And I just laughed, oh, yeah, right. I'm ready. No, I'm not ready to come back. I haven't learned enough. And I've only been gone just over a year, so not quite. I think I need some more training out here in the real world. And so that was a Friday. The next day, my phone rang at home. And one of the things you have to know is our controller was hugely respectful of life. And he didn't call you at night or on a Saturday unless it was truly an emergency, which really didn't happen that often in accounting. Unless our systems were down and he thought there was something we could do about it, you just didn't go to call on a Saturday. This was a Saturday morning, and he called and he said, "Hey." I was like, "Hi." And he said, "Are you sitting down?" And I was like, "Really? I need to be sitting down?" And he said, "Maybe." And he said, "You know, I really wasn't joking. I really would like you to consider coming back." And I was like, "Keith, for real?" And he said, "Yeah, we announced yesterday that we've launched the new concept, CarMax, and we're going to roll it nationwide. And I want you to come back and I want you to join that team." And I was like, "You mean I said, "I know we launched that before I left, and I had remembered even in 1990 the CFO walking in and saying, 'Angie, we have to figure out how to do used car lending.'" And I just laughed at him completely. I'm like, "Used car lending? Are you crazy? We're not ever going to do that." Well, so I interviewed. I spent some time with Austin Legan and Mark O'Neill, who were, and Tom Folliard, who were leading that charge at the time. And lo and behold, we decided to go back. So I moved back to Richmond about March of '96. And I started as, and I guess I should say that the reason I finally said yes is that the controller called me again after my interviewing. I was considering the position, and he called and said, "I just accepted the CFO of CarMax position, and you will report directly to me." Okay, fine. I accept. I'll take the job, and I'll come back. So I did, and I thought my whole career was planned out, that I would work for him till I retired or he retired. I would be the assistant controller of all processing, sort of receivables, payables, payroll, not the true, real accounting gig, but everything on the processing side. And I had my first child, and we had a blast in that first year, and we started bringing over responsibility for different accounts to the CarMax team. We were only a team of maybe 10 at the time. I think I might have been number 10 or number 11. And about May of the following year of '97, Keith called me into his office, and I thought, uh-oh, what have I done? My first response was always, what did I miss? What hole in the dam do I not have my finger on? And I don't know why I always thought it was something negative, but I did. I wanted to be ready, I guess. And so I walk in, and he said, "Okay, I know I had you in Richmond." He goes, "But I want you to move to Atlanta." I went, "Atlanta? Are we moving our corporate office? Why am I going to Atlanta?" And he said, "I want you to take over responsibility for," at the time we were called First North American Credit Corporation. We didn't want it branded to align with CarMax at the time. But it was basically the installment lending arm of the company, and it was then run by the bank, by the credit card bank. He said, "I want you to go take that division." And I just looked at him and I said, "I have moved twice in the last 2 years. Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure. This is where I want you to go." And I said, "Well, you need to convince me that is this where my career is really going to grow? Is this what you see my future? Is there a lot for me to do?" And he said, so he did the math for me. He said, "Okay, we have 4 stores today. We're going to grow to 80 stores, and this is where the receivables are today, and this is where they're going to be by this point." He goes, "You think that's enough growth for you?" I was like, okay, I get it, fine. So we moved the family, my 6-month-old, down to Atlanta, and I took this team, which was 40 people, and we were about 250 million in receivables, and we were supporting 4 stores. And it was me. It was my first promotion into a director position there, and I had 1 manager reporting to me. And I remember as the lady who had had my job before retired in order to take care of 2 adopted children she just adopted. And she said, "Everything's working pretty well. It should all be okay." And then you start digging in, and the first year you kind of find out, oh wow, there's some things we need to fix. And I remember at one point I said, it's interesting being that first director job, right? Am I supposed to be able to handle this on my own, or should I be calling for help? Well, I'm a director now. I should handle it. Well, this is kind of big. Maybe not. So I've always been a big fan of partner, partner, partner. It's just better. So I called my boss and said, hey, I've identified this problem. I'm pretty sure it's not small. And he said, I'll call you back in 30 minutes. And then I think this was also a Friday. So he called me back and said, okay, on Monday morning, I will have this person, this person, this person. I'll be there. You be there. You bring this information. Set us up a room. And we were war rooming our problem together, which is fabulous. What I think if anybody could ever find that job where you've got great people around you. And I always said I kind of felt like at Circuit City that you were encouraged to walk out on limbs, to take chances. And I kind of felt like there was always a trampoline below me and ready to catch me. So we took more chances. We were a little more adventurous and a little more willing to take a risk and be wrong, or and we learned so much by doing that. But I had this team, and we fixed things, and then we started talking to the stores about what was working and what wasn't, and turned out they had a list of what they thought wasn't working. And so we fixed those things, and then we just sort of launched from there, right? And so we were 250 million receivables, and the skills it took to go from 250 million to 500 million were different than the skills to 1 billion. And were very different the skills to get to 2 billion or 4 billion. And while, you know, as you can tell through my career, I had been moving every year or so. And I was used to that. I was used to going in, learning it fast, fixing what needed to be fixed, making a big splash difference, you know, making it better, and moving on. And here I was with something that I was like, okay, wow, how long am I going to do this? And 2 years passed, and 3 years passed, and there was absolutely no boredom, because I had to keep up with the growth personally of the organization, and it was bigger than I probably expected, because you're not just growing as a person, as a leader. All of a sudden you've got different layers reporting to you, and then you have new layers, and where you used to be the one actually signing titles to release them, now you've got teams doing that and delegating authority. And maybe we ran a little bit more like an entrepreneur to start, where it was high-level decisioning stayed with us, and we made decisions every day at lunch. Probably had lunch with my executive as we built an executive team. We had lunch every day, and those decisions were made then, and then we moved on, but probably daily. And when you go after your first billion to your second and to your fourth, then you're looking out for 8, and 8 is actually when I retired. So, and that was, so I started discussing my retirement in 2014. So there was a lot of learning and a lot of growth and development. Luckily, at some point in my career, I had an executive coach, and you could be real honest with an executive coach, right? And they could be brutally honest with you, which was good. And I remember skill development being part of it. And then I looked at him one day and I said, okay, I can do skill development. We're going to put all those in these 2 columns. But my 3rd column of things I want to work on, I said, I want to understand strategy. Everybody I talk to keeps saying this word strategy. I don't have any idea what they're talking about. What's your strategy, Angie? And I'm going, get better, do better, be more efficient, make more money. What do you mean strategy? And wow, that was a great endeavor. And probably one of the best books I read on that was Becoming a Strategic Leader. And it broke down strategy into strategic thinking. I could do that. Strategic action, I was doing that, and then strategic influence. And that was my real aha moment, because I could influence my team, but I kind of had the leg up on them, right? I was sort of the one in charge. But influencing my Richmond peers, that was tough because I wasn't in Richmond. And even when I went to Richmond, I might have 2 days there. So there was less, hey, let's go out for lunch, or let's sit, hang in a hallway. We had less experiences together. Most of those guys were leading stores and leading actions very oriented to stores. And I think they really wanted me to do was just keep leading the finance unit, because they didn't really want to know a lot about it. And they just wanted to know that it was safe and secure, and it wouldn't cause any problems, and it would keep making money. And I kind of was okay with that in a lot of ways. I loved my work, and I loved that team, and it was fun. And so we built that team. Probably one of the biggest challenges we ever faced was the recession. All of a sudden, the capital markets closed, and that's how our business operated. We loaned money to customers, we built receivables on a credit line from a bank, and then once we got a population, we sold them to the capital markets and through bonds. And all of a sudden, you could do that anymore. And I remember just we all just sat down at a table and looked at each other and said, what in the world are we going to do? And we said, okay, this is how much money we have left on our credit line. So how are we going to use it? Do we, kind of let it leak out and save it for the end? Do we just keep our, the foot to the pedal and just spend it, lend as much as we can for as long as we can? Treasury started to look at different ways we could raise money. And I started to look at different ways we could actually use some of our partner lenders to take some of the volume. I will tell you that I stood in front of the executive team at one point and I said, 14 days and counting. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, that's how much cash I have. That's all the capital we have. We are going to get this deal done. And we did. Treasury did a great job leading that. And in combination, we did masterful things to push off some volume to our partner lenders. We raised some capital in new and different ways, and we protected sales, which was, I think, the place. And also our losses weren't quite as bad as people thought they were. So for years, CarMax we just got pummeled. Oh, you're a retailer and you have this finance unit. It's kind of in the days when retailers started to get out of this business. Even manufacturers during the recession started to get out of the business on the car side. And sometimes the analysts thought we should be getting out. There are a couple of learnings I had from watching Circuit City go through that with their credit card bank. One of the things I never did was let our senior executive teams not fully understand credit, how we operated, where the value was, where the incremental sales really lied, so that we really never made that decision haphazardly. So as we exited the recession, one of the things I think that worked really well for me there is I earned even more credibility with the senior team, because and my peers there, because we didn't blow up as everybody had feared. The market gained huge respect for our business model, and they said, yep, it worked just like they said it would. So my street cred kind of grew a little bit, and that was exciting. But I guess as we started to exit that, one of the things career-wise that started to be prevalent to me is if I wanted to take a next step, that meant I had to move to Richmond. Our senior executive team was all in Richmond. I was the only person off-site. It's really tough to influence from that far away. We would have senior executive meetings, and literally I was the spider phone. I was the speaker phone in the middle of the table. I wasn't really Angie. And if I had a point to make, they had to all be quiet. And if they're going to all be quiet, it better be really good. So the jokes, I couldn't really laugh because I could only hear part of them. So it's definitely one of those things where I either needed to be really excited and dedicated to the job I had, or I was going to need to move to Richmond. So one option I had was to move to Richmond and be in competition for the CFO job. And because my boss, I knew, would want to retire at some point. But I didn't really want to be the CFO. I think we're going back to the accounting world again, right? So I just knew that the company needed, in my opinion, the company needed someone that had that full accounting background. Maybe it was a little bit of me deciding that, underestimating what I could do. But it also meant a move, and I just really didn't want to move. And so I opted out, and I opted instead to support our best candidate and really make sure that he could be successful, and identify where he could grow and I was continuing to grow, but where we could be strong as a team in that development. And then, so I was promoted to senior VP just before my boss exited, and then we created a senior executive team. There was 9 of us. So you had the CEO and 2 EVPs, and then the rest of us. And it was me and 8 guys. So, but I was honestly very used to that. It never even crossed my mind. And if I look back, there are probably only 2 times in my career where I was very aware that I was a woman. One was when I was first promoted to an officer of CarMax. And as my announcement went out, I started getting all these phone calls from other women in the organization who started to say, "Congratulations, you finally broke the ceiling. That's so great. You're the first woman on the executive team." This is really kind of crazy. But I walked into my boss's office and I shut the door and I said, "Did you promote me because I'm a woman? Because if you did, you can have it back." He was like, "What are you talking about?" And I just said, "I will not earn it based on being a woman. I want to earn it on my own." And he's like, "Absolutely not. You've done this and this and this and this." And I'm like, "Well, all these people keep telling me congratulations, not because I've done a great job, but because I'm a woman." And I started to realize what women expected of me was maybe more than I understood. And that was good for me to know as a leader of the company. The other time that I was well aware I was a woman actually happened before this, but I was young and running this organization, but we were doing our first securitization. And the woman from S&P was in charge of autos. She was in to evaluate our book of business. And she was pregnant, and I realized that. So at the first hour of the meeting, I called for a break. I said, "Would you like to go to the restroom?" And she said, "Absolutely, thank you." I was like, I've been in your shoes, so let's go. So I walked in the restroom with her, and she said, "Well, this is a first." And I thought, "Oh dear Lord, what is wrong in this bathroom? What have we done? What's wrong?" And I'm like, "I really need her to like us." And I said, "Oh, what's wrong?" And she said, "No, it's the first time I've ever gone to the restroom with the president of a bank." I was like, "Well, oh, I'm a girl, you're a girl, we're both going to the restroom together. Wow, this is kind of crazy." And I probably wasn't even aware that I was a woman in a man's world at that point, and because I didn't know a lot of other people that ran bank operations for companies. But those are probably 2 times in my life and my experiences. And but otherwise, I was really blessed with people that worked for me that never were taken aback, never always wanted to be there, always learned. It was amazing how many of the guys wanted to read books I was reading because they had daughters and wanted to understand how do I raise them to be secure in themselves? How do I raise them to take risk? And so we had great conversations about that always. And then the guys from my Richmond team were always real supportive. open to my thoughts and opinions, even though I was really mostly doing finance and they were doing stores. But they always wanted to hear from me, which was really great. You know, if I think about sort of career, as I decided not to pursue the CFO job, then I had to decide, okay, how much longer do I want to do this job? And I had been doing it since 97, and this was about 2013 when I really started to think, what's next for me? And then I sort of thought I would travel down one of three paths. I would either, let's go get back to school and get my MBA while I'm working. Maybe I could go get on a board seat, or maybe I exit and take a new job. I really didn't want to do the exit and take a new job or move to Richmond, and I kind of decided I didn't want to move to Richmond. But the other two were pretty interesting to me, and but most of what I had heard is that MBA for me at that point in time wasn't going to really add a lot of value. And even an EMBA, I just had enough behind me, although it might be great if I wanted to be a professor in college if I had it. But outside of that, there was not a lot of value seen. So I started working on, I thought, oh, board seat, that's what I should do. That'll give me that next sort of challenge. And so I started working on resume. I worked with our board members, who were fabulous, by the way, and always supportive. One of the board members met with me and he said, I need you to understand something about getting a board job. He said, it is very different than any other job you'll ever get. He goes, you can't call and ask for it. I'm like, oh, really? He's like, no, that is not how this works. And I said, okay, so how does it work? And so we walked through that with a lot of focus. But one of the things I joined this, it's actually an executive women's group. It's called the Committee of 200, and full of high-ranking business women on the corporate side and high-ranking women business owners on the entrepreneurial side. And I started spending time with them, those who had owned their own businesses and what that took, those who had gone from career to board, and were just now talking retirement at age 70. I started looking at what the board work really was, and I'd been reporting to our board for a long time. But compliance and cybersecurity were so, compensation, those seem like the top three topics. And I thought, boy, what's the fun? Where's the fun part of this? Grow the business, be exciting, And and then everyone wanted me to be the financial expert. So they wanted me on their audit committee, accounting. I really should have been an accountant. I wasn't meant to be an engineer. I was supposed to be an accountant. But they wanted me on their audit committee, which was great. However, it meant that I was going to be reading press releases, earnings releases, 10Ks, 10Qs. I knew what the accounting calendar looked like. I knew the demands, and I knew that there's no option. It is the priority. It is how the calendar is built. And I looked at my husband and I said, can I just retire? And he's like, no. I'm like, I was like, oh, come on, why not? I've been working since I was 15. I'm like, I have worked solid except one semester off. I would just love a sabbatical. He's like, you will be bored, and then I will become your priority. I was like, uh-oh. I said, but come on. And so we honestly started looking at it, and we sat down with a financial planner when I was 45, and I said, okay, I want to retire by the time I'm 50. And he said, well, if you make it to 50, you'll stay till you're 55. And I said, why? And he said, you have golden handcuffs, because we had a vesting program at 55. He said, I'll do the math for you, but if you make it to 50, you're definitely going to want to work those last 5 years. And I looked at him, and I looked at my husband, and I looked at him again, and I said, okay, I want to retire at 48. He's like, that is not the answer I thought you were going to give me. And I said, I want to do so. I think I have a chance at doing something totally different. I have no idea what that is, but I can. Why can't we? Why not? And he said, you can financially, you're okay. If that's really what you think you need, you're good. And I remember throwing out some number. If we can't live off X amount a month, X many dollars per month, then we ought to be shot. And I said, okay, so, but what do other people say? And he said, that's usually people's travel budget. I was like, oh no, what have I signed us up for? But I'm blessed and very blessed with a wonderful husband who also had his own career. And he was doing great things for our family as well. And so we were just well positioned where it looked like I could exit and we'd be all right. So I started working on that and making sure I had hired my successor. I'd given him all kinds of assignments. He was a risk guy, very analytical, math-oriented guy, even more than me. But I taught him operations. How do you manage an operation that big? How do you do that many people? And he was doing great. I just kept giving him different assignments and moving departments around, and I knew that he was going to be ready, and I either needed to be prepared that he's going to go find a spot and I'm going to need to do it again, or I'm going to need to somehow get out of the way so that he could actually take that lead position. So we started working on it a little bit at a time. And I should probably point out a couple of things that were really poignant for me in terms of retirement and watching others. I mentioned having the CFO of Circuit City, who is my mentor, and at a very young age, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Watched him go through that and his family go through that, and I knew that could happen to anybody, including me. Our board, Rick Sharp, who was the chairman of our board of Circuit City and of CarMax, he also got Alzheimer's. Wow, you really start to think of life differently when you watch some of the most successful people in your life who had lots of money not be able to buy their way out of a situation. And then one of my mentors who was really close to me, he usually ran fraud. And I remember being 22 and doing my first trip to Pennsylvania and needing to get on an earlier flight. And he marched me up to that counter and said he was my dad and he needed to get me on the next flight. And he was that kind of person to me and was always in for a good laugh. He was a Vietnam vet, so he had some really great stories and a really great outlook on life. But he was a sailor, was building a house in St. Croix, and he was going to retire. Going to retire next year. And then he had a heart attack, and he was too far away from medical care to be saved. And so he died before he could retire and before he made it to St. Croix. Having watched that, those later years you just want to spend them differently. I did anyway. It was pretty impactful. I decided I wasn't just going to be on the wheel, on the carousel, and just keep riding it around. And then I watched even my boss, who was the CFO, he was convinced. He was out at a certain age, and I was never shy with him. I would always ask him the most direct questions in the world, which were like, when are you leaving? When are you retiring? I need to know when you're planning on retiring. And he had a whole plan, and then our CEO, Austin Ligon, decided after a reunion that it was his time. He wanted to retire, and I think he was only 50. I could be totally wrong in the ages, but he was younger than my boss, but his exit meant my boss was staying. You couldn't let the CEO and the CFO exit. So he ended up staying, bringing on the new CEO, really doing his part, and then the recession hit. And you can't leave when the storm is brewing and the waves are crashing. You just really can't do that. So he probably worked at least 5 years more than his plan, maybe even 7. So I also knew based on the cyclicality of the economy and being in finance and selling cars, that as a senior executive, I had to really be careful about when my exit occurred. And I almost decided that it could only occur when things were great. I wouldn't leave if it was stormy. I'm not going to walk out then. I never wanted to be in a position where they asked me to leave. That would have just killed me, unless it was for some reason that, it was time for us to sell the bank or the finance unit. But I didn't want to get to that position. So in 2014, things were great. I had my successor was in place. The senior team was doing great. We had, sales were great. And so I walked in and said, I think it's time. Much to their dismay, they're like, what? You are not on our list of people that we thought might exit anytime soon. I was 46, although days away from turning 47. We negotiated my exit, and I went in January of 2015. I had just turned 47, and I consulted with the senior team I was leaving behind for about 6 months, just to make sure they were good, that my successor, as he had questions, and I had exposed him to a number of things so that he'd be ready. And I remember in our first quarter and one of the consulting lunches, he said, you used to say X, Y, or Z. Now I get it. Having lived in the seat, seen it, now I get it. I just didn't truly understand until I've actually sat in the seat. So I did it. And I had some great wisdom from a dear friend. He looked at me square in the eyes and he said, just remember, there's unlimited demand for free labor. I looked at him and I went, he goes, people are going to start calling you, whether it is sitting on a nonprofit board or whether it's come help me do X, Y, or Z, or he said, your phone's going to start ringing, and just remember, there's just unlimited demand out there, so set your boundaries. And so I worked on my little spiel, and as soon as we announced, I just told everybody, I'm taking a year off. In 12 months, feel free to call me at the end of 12 months if you still have interest and think there's something I can do for you. And it was a good thing I was prepared for that. I think my phone rang off the hook for the first week and a half. And even as I left industry, folks in the industry, you can't leave. Why don't you stay on this board, or why don't you stay on that board? Stay in auto. And I kind of felt like I needed to exit the scene, that I needed to give my successor the space. He deserved it, and as long as I was there, it would sort of put a shadow on his place. And if I was going to exit, I needed to exit, and so I did. And we changed everything in life, absolutely everything. We had been in this house since we'd moved to Atlanta. I had his last 6 months, so I have a son, just one. When I retired, he was in his senior year of high school, so I got his last 6 months of high school with him and all the grad parties, and just got to just pour in some really good time with him. We started getting the house ready for sale. We had purchased some family property with my husband and I that was just north of us. His grandparents had lived there, and so we had purchased it, and that's where we were moving. It's like there's no reason for us to have a house in the neighborhood, and we can have a house up there. So we did that over the summer. We sent our kid off to college in August, and we came home and closed on the house sale. It sold in 9 hours. My husband's like, what? I was like, okay, my part's done, because he was kind of preparing the house on the other end, and I was in charge of getting our house sold, and we sold it in 9 hours. So he's like, buy me some time. We're not ready, because we were just taking on the family property. There's his grandpa's old house, and then his great-grandma had a home there. It was a little cottage. So we're going to destroy it and put a home there and build next to his grandparents. And my husband called some guys, and they came and evaluated it and said they could move it. I was like, move it? And he said, yeah. And they literally put these steel beams under it, moved it across the property, jacked it up a bit, and built a basement under it set it back down. We redid the interior. Well, we redid almost everything in it. Put a wraparound porch on it, and that's actually where my husband and I moved into. We went from, I retired and we moved into 950 square feet. But we were on 38 acres. So it was, I mean, you want space, you just walk outside. So it's been an adventure, right? We sold a house, we moved. I'm all of a sudden picking out tile, and I'm a designer. I felt like Joanna Gay. We were chipping Joanna. I'm like, we could do our whole filming here. And then we started focusing on the land. We all of a sudden had 38 acres, and then we had another 12 acres sort of across the street that we owned with his brother. And so what do we want to do with it? How do we want to monetize it? Do we want to monetize it or not? And that kept my entrepreneurial business brain going. It's got an old grist mill on it, so we could redo the grist mill and get it running again. We could actually grind corn and manufacture grits. Do we want to do it and be more museum, or do we want to do it and sell retail? Do we want to do it and sell wholesale? So I started penciling out all these different ventures that we could do, whether it was truly opening the mill again, which is a great spot for Cherokee County, or if we wanted to become a venue. Do we want to do weddings or meeting venue? Or what do we want to do with the land? Do we want to sell it? Do we want to lease it? And so it's truly kept my mind, I guess, sharp. not quite at the same level of as raising $5 billion in capital a year, but different. Totally different. Negotiating leases, dealing with attorneys, all kinds of different agreements that have to be done when you're leasing property. So I got very involved in all of that. It's fascinating to me because a lot of people say their first year after retirement is truly hard. And I guess for me it wasn't at all, because everything changed. So I had to change everything. What a blessing. What a blessing. But it's still unclear exactly what my true next chapter is. Is there will I launch a business? Will I'm pretty convinced boardroom is not where I'm headed. I might do that for someone I really adored, because it would have to be pretty important for me to give up the freedom. Of course, if things went way awry, I could do anything. I told my husband one day, I was like, I'll work at Chick-fil-A. I don't care. He's like, for real? I said, I started at McDonald's. Why not? I'm like, barista at Starbucks? That'd be great stories you could tell being a barista at Starbucks. I have a lot of friends who are like, why don't you write a book? I'm like, because everybody's writing a book. I don't know. I don't have a book to be written just yet. But I truly am just taking a little bit at a time, and each day I like to make a difference in somebody's life, and that I find super rewarding, whether it's just listening or whether it's truly passing on some wisdom or helping them solve a problem, and whether those are neighbors or they are executive women in business who have just not sure where to go. And I kind of get my little giggles that way. I get a thrill if I can just make a little bit of difference each time. So if I had one piece of advice to a college student, I think it would be, as lame as this might sound, but work hard and play hard, because life is short. It truly is. So you have to balance, but you need to work hard. Don't expect it to be given to you. Work, figure it out, add value, and the rest will follow. But then also take care of yourself. Don't get in the rut of not drinking enough water, not working out, not spending any time taking care of the only body you've got. So that would probably be, and then just love everybody around you and have a good time.